Jasmine Crockett sat at the witness table, hands folded, eyes locked straight ahead. She had come prepared, stacks of files, color-coded tabs, and the patience of someone who knew the show would come before the truth. Jim Jordan leaned back in his chair on the House Oversight Committee dais, shirt sleeves rolled up like always, the everyman act that hid how much he loved the camera. He shuffled his papers, lips twisted into a grin that told the world he thought this would be easy. Jim said, "Congresswoman Crockett, let me just ask you, do you really expect the American people to believe you care about constitutional law when your own party has shredded it time and again?" Jasmine didn't flinch. Jasmine said, "Do you have an example, Chairman Jordan? Or are we just tossing big words around today?" A few staffers stifled laughs. Jim's grin twitched. "Not as easy now." Jim said, "Let's talk about the Second Amendment. You've called for common-sense gun reforms. Do you know what shall not be infringed means?" Jasmine's smile was calm, voice steady. Jasmine said, "It means exactly what the courts have said it means. And the courts have upheld regulation for centuries. So unless you've rewritten the Bill of Rights overnight, you might want to double-check your notes." The room cracked with a low murmur. Reporters scribbled faster. Jim leaned forward, voice sharper. Jim said, "So you admit you want to infringe on people's rights?" Jasmine tilted her head slightly, eyes locked on his. Jasmine said, "I admit I read the whole Constitution, not just the parts that make for good fundraising emails." One or two laughs slipped out, but the hush that followed hit harder. Jim tried to push past it. Jim said, "Let's move on. Do you even understand the difference between a statute and a constitutional right?" Jasmine's eyebrows lifted, her patience slipping. Jasmine said, "Are you asking because you don't know, or because you think I don't?" Jim's grin spread again, forced but still there. Jim said, "You're on record confusing the two multiple times." Jasmine leaned forward, her tone sharp enough to slice through the stale air. Jasmine said, "I'm on record passing bar exams and practicing law. Two things you've never done." The front row gasped, not loud, but enough to ripple down the row of staffers behind him. Jim snapped his folder shut. Jim said, "You think you're clever, Congresswoman, but the American people see through your double talk." Jasmine didn't move, her voice dropping to that slow, controlled cut. Jasmine said, "The only thing the American people see is you flailing because you don't know the basics of what you're yelling about." The chairman banged his gavel lightly, but even he knew this wasn't done. Jim leaned back, eyes narrowing. Jim said, "So you think you're smarter than the Constitution now?" Jasmine said, "No, Chairman Jordan, but I know the Constitution better than you. And if you'd actually finished your JD instead of just screaming about it, maybe you'd know what due process really means." The room sucked in a breath. You could feel it, that moment when everyone knew they'd just seen the opening crack. And Jasmine didn't look away, not once. Jim Jordan shifted in his seat, tapping his stack of papers like they might magically turn into something that could shut her down. He looked out at the cameras, that practiced grin flickering for just a second. Jim said, "Congresswoman Crockett, you like to lecture us all about the law, but you're ignoring the fact that your so-called reforms violate basic constitutional protections." Jasmine didn't blink. Jasmine said, "You keep saying violate. Show me where. Cite the case. Cite the statute. I'll wait." A few heads turned in the gallery, reporters smirking as they scribbled faster. Jim cleared his throat. Jim said, "It's common sense. Everyone knows the Second Amendment is absolute." Jasmine leaned in, her tone dropping to a slow, sharp line that made even the aides behind her freeze. Jasmine said, "Everyone except the Supreme Court, apparently. District of Columbia versus Heller. McDonald v. Chicago. Even Justice Scalia wrote that reasonable restrictions are constitutional. Did you miss that day in Con Law 101, Chairman Jordan?" Jim's mouth tightened. He flipped a page, grasping at another line of attack. Jim said, So you think you're better than half the country that wants their guns left alone? Jasmine shook her head slowly, like she was explaining the alphabet to a toddler. Jasmine said, I think I'm better than fearmongers who pretend the Second Amendment means no laws at all. That's not patriotism. That's negligence. A soft wave of stifled laughs rolled through the back of the hearing room, the kind that cut deeper than a shout. Jim jabbed a finger at her, voice louder now. Jim said, You're twisting my words. You always do. You want to gut the Bill of Rights piece by piece. Jasmine's eyebrows lifted just a hair. Jasmine said, You'd know the difference between gutting and regulating if you'd ever read a single Supreme Court decision. You keep saying the law like it's a toy for your sound bites. It's not. Jim snapped back, forcing a laugh that fell flat. Jim said, Keep lecturing. It won't save you when voters see your real record. Jasmine's voice dropped, so quiet the room had to lean in just to catch it. Jasmine said, My record is public. My votes are public. And so is yours. Every time you grandstand about freedom but can't explain a single precedent that backs you up. Jim slammed his folder shut, the paper crack echoing off the walls. He tried to push it back to the committee chair, but Jasmine kept going, calm, steady, every word landing like a hammer. Jasmine said, You know what, Chairman? Maybe it's time you do what you should have done 20 years ago. Pick up a textbook. Sit down in a classroom. Learn the difference between talking loud and actually knowing the law. Jim's face flushed, that grin gone for good now. He leaned back, eyes darting to the other Republicans at the table for support, but no one jumped in. Jasmine said, Because if you don't understand the Constitution, you shouldn't hide behind it. And if you can't defend it with facts, then maybe, just maybe, you should go back to law school. The room fell silent. The chairman didn't gavel. The reporters' pens didn't stop scratching. And Jim Jordan sat there, frozen in his own empty folder. Jim Jordan sat stiff, his hand tapping the folder that now looked more like a prop than a plan. He forced a laugh, too loud, too sharp, trying to reclaim an authority that had slipped through his fingers a dozen minutes ago. Jim said, Congresswoman Crockett, you can sit there acting smug all you want, but the truth is the American people see through your spin. Jasmine didn't even lean back. She stayed right where she was, voice calm, eyes locked on him like she was reading him line by line. Jasmine said, The truth is the American people see exactly what you're doing. And more important, they see what you don't know. Jim jabbed the air with his pen, that grin now brittle. Jim said, I know enough to know this country's tired of lawyers like you twisting every word to push an agenda. Jasmine's tone was like glass, cold and clear. Jasmine said, No, Chairman Jordan, you know just enough to rile people up and not enough to fix a single thing that's broken. The chairman's gavel hovered, but nobody wanted to bang it. Even the aides behind him stayed still, eyes darting from Jim's red face to Jasmine's steady stare. Jim tried one last swing, half insult, half plea for the audience. Jim said, So, what? You think you're better than everyone else up here? Jasmine didn't blink. Jasmine said, I think I know the law better than you. And I think you know that too. That's why you're shouting instead of citing. A ripple of muffled laughs cracked through the gallery. Even a couple of reporters in the front row couldn't hide their smirks behind their notes. Jim's fingers drummed faster, papers rustling under his palm like they might rescue him if he just flipped fast enough. Jasmine leaned in, voice softer now, but so clear you could feel the silence stretching to every corner of the room. Jasmine said, You like to talk about the Constitution, but you weaponize it because you don't understand it. You shout about freedom, but you never do the homework to protect it. And you talk about law, Chairman Jordan, but you've made a career out of not knowing it. The hush that followed was thick enough to choke on. No gavel, no coughs, just the sound of one man pinned under the weight of his own ignorance. Jasmine straightened her notes, closing her folder with a quiet snap. Jasmine said, This isn't a circus, Mr. Chairman. It's Congress. Maybe act like you belong here. Or better yet, go back to law school. Jim's eyes dropped to the table. The committee chair cleared his throat, tapping the mic. But the echo of her words had already settled like a stone in every headline waiting to hit the feed. This is the USA Liberty. Subscribe if you're tired of people hiding behind a constitution they can't even explain. Subscribe if you know that knowing the law is the first step to changing it. Subscribe because sometimes one voice in the room, steady, calm, unflinching, is all it takes to expose a lie that's been shouted too long. Truth wins when we know enough to say it.